Good morning. In 6 weeks, we'll have a state election here in Victoria. Elections raise the question of leadership. What kind of leaders should we follow? It's a question for society in general, and it's a question for the church. What kind of leaders should we follow? What kind of leaders should we appoint or elect? What kind of leaders should we be? Have you decided for whom you will vote in the upcoming state election? For which candidate? For which party? Yesterday, Catherine was at the local shopping centre, and when she returned to the car after shopping, she found a political advertisement placed on the windscreen of the car. Ostensibly, it's publicity for the Women United Party. Although I'm not sure that such a political party actually exists in Victoria, and the independent candidate pictured on the flyer is in fact a middle-aged Greek man. Leaving that aside, what struck me when I read the flyer was that this candidate claims that Victoria is experiencing a crisis of leadership. He says that the Victorian Labor government is destroying the economy and the health system, and that we need to lift our voices and get free from their tyranny. Well, I don't know if you agree with this analysis of Victorian state politics. You have 6 weeks to decide. But today we turn our attention to a time in the history of Old Testament Israel when God's people were experiencing a crisis of leadership. We are beginning a new sermon series on the Old Testament books, 1 and 2 Samuel. The beginning of 1 Samuel takes us back more than 3,000 years to around the year 1050 BC. After Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land of Canaan, the next couple of centuries were a time of social instability. The people lurched from crisis to crisis, mostly of their own making. And again, God raised up judges to rescue and rule them for a time. But after each judge disappeared from the scene, the people's sin led them into a new disaster, in a descending moral spiral. You can read about that period in the book of Judges. Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the book of Judges comes immediately before 1 and 2 Samuel. And the final verse of the book of Judges describes Israel's crisis of leadership like this. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. 1 and 2 Samuel then describe the beginnings of monarchy in Israel and Israel's famous first 2 kings, Saul and David. We'll meet them later in our series, but that is not where we begin. We heard 1 Samuel read to us. Let me encourage you to keep a Bible open there. You can find 1 Samuel chapter 1 on page 271 of the Red Bibles. 1 and 2 Samuel is a story of kings, but it begins with one woman's prayer, the prayer of one weeping, anguished woman. In verse 1, we read there was a certain man from Ramathaim, a Zuphite from the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, the son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, the son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. Those are obscure names and places. not just obscure for us because we don't know the world of the Old Testament very well, but obscure even then. This certain man is presented as a bit of a nobody, as the Beatles might put it. He's a real nowhere man. Well, in the Bible, we need to pay attention when someone seems to be nobody special, because it usually means that God is up to something special. Well, in verse 2 we find that the focus is not really on this man, but on his wife, or rather his first wife. We read, he had 2 wives. One was called Hannah and the other Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. And then in verses 3 to 8 we read about Hannah's suffering because of her childlessness. Elkanah is presented as a pious man. Every year he takes his family to worship at the shrine at Shiloh, perhaps for one of the major festivals mentioned in the Old Testament. And clearly he loves Hannah, but perhaps he doesn't quite understand the depths of her plight. Every year they go, they sacrifice, and he distributes the meat from the sacrifice for everyone to eat. And every year Peninnah uses this as an opportunity to ridicule Hannah, because Peninnah has children while Hannah has none. And this drives Hannah to despair. This annual pilgrimage of worship for Hannah is an annual ritual of humiliation. And perhaps Elkanah doesn't quite understand how deep his wife's anguish is when we hear him in verse 8. Her husband Elkanah would say to her, Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons? And perhaps there's a little note there of Elkanah saying, Hannah, stop thinking about yourself and think about me. Maybe he's getting a little frustrated. Well, Hannah takes matters into her own hands. One time when they're there, as they were every year at Shiloh to worship, Hannah goes into the Lord's house, into the shrine there, and we read that in her deep anguish, in her grief, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. She prays from the heart, but she only mouths the words. She's not speaking out loud. And so the priest there, Eli, sees her and thinks she must be drunk, as if things weren't bad enough for Hannah already. She comes and prays this heartfelt prayer, and the priest assumes she's a drunkard and wants to send her on her way. She tells him that's not the case, and he realises what's happening. And we see Eli's response in verse 17. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him. She said, may your servant find favour in your eyes. And then she went her way and ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. This is the turning point in Hannah's story. There are a couple of other clues as to what's happening here. The first is that we read in verse 3 that when Elkanah goes up each year with the family, he prays to and worships and offers sacrifices to the Lord Almighty, or the Lord of hosts, that is the Lord of armies. And in the Bible they might be earthly armies or heavenly armies, but this is the first time God is described like this in the Old Testament as the Lord Almighty, or the Lord of hosts. And it's a name that points to God's great power and resources. And so it's curious then, when we read, twice we read it in verse 5 and again in verse 6, that the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. That's unusual. Often we read about God in the Bible as the one who opens the womb. But here God is described as the one who has closed Hannah's womb. And it's emphasised, we read it twice in a row, which tells us that in Hannah's distress, God is up to something. And when God is up to something, it is something good. But what is God doing here? In verses 19 and 20, we find that God does indeed answer Hannah's prayer. She gives birth to a son and names him Samuel. Well, then in the last part of the chapter, we read about Elkanah returning again to Shiloh for worship. We read, when her husband Elkanah went up with all his family to offer the annual sacrifice to the Lord and to fulfill his vow, Hannah did not go. She stayed behind and said, I'll go when I've weaned the child. And that might be a few years. Elkanah is going to fulfill his vow. And that poses a question. Is Hannah going to fulfill her vow? Is she going to keep her promise to the Lord that if he gives her a son, she will give her son to the Lord in his service? Well, the question is answered, and Hannah does take her son and present him to Eli the priest. And we read in verses 27 and 28 at the end of the chapter, I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked of him. The Lord has given. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he shall be given over to the Lord. There's a lovely footnote to Hannah's story if you read on in chapter 2, where we read that God took care of her and was gracious to her, and she gave birth to 3 more sons in time and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, Samuel would become a key leader of God's people. We'll read more about Samuel in coming weeks. But today, what are we to make of Hannah's story? Well, to answer that, we need to consider the relationship between Hannah's story and 2 other stories. We need to think about Hannah's story and the story of Israel's kings. And we need to think about Hannah's story and our story. First, how does Hannah's story relate to the story of Israel's kings? Or to ask the question another way, why does the story of 1 and 2 Samuel start here? It's a story of kings, but it doesn't start with a king or even with a king's family line. No, it starts with an obscure family and with one desperate woman's prayer. Why does it start there? Remember the situation at the end of the book of Judges? In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Well, Hannah's personal story points to God as the help of the helpless, and as Samuel is God's gracious gift to Hannah. In the bigger story of 1 and 2 Samuel, kings are God's gift to help helpless Israel. There is a clue in Hannah's name, which means grace. Now, the story is more complicated than that, simply the kings being God's gift to help helpless Israel. We'll see in coming weeks that Israel asks with the wrong motives for the wrong kind of king, and God lets them taste the consequences of that for a while. But beyond that, he has a better plan to give them a better king, a king after his own heart, and ultimately to give his own son, Jesus, to be the rescuer and ruler of a helpless world. So as we read this story of kings, remember the story of Hannah. Well, second, how does Hannah's story relate to our story, to your story? When have you felt helpless? I felt helpless this week. I came in on Wednesday and there was a power outage. And I had a look at our big switchboard in the kitchen, and a couple of circuits had tripped, but there was no power. The whole board was dead. So that's above my pay grade to fix, and I started madly calling all the electricians I knew, and no one was answering until finally the lovely James Anderson answered my distress call and was able to drop everything and come quickly. And he got the switchboard working again, and we had power, but it was going to need some attention. There were a few drops of water in there, bad mixture, water and electricity, and there were some parts that were starting to fail. We had power. I came back on Thursday morning and the power had gone again. I called James and he came back promptly and opened up the switchboard again, and this time we found not a few drops of water but a lot of water in the switchboard. Very bad. Well, we had an urgent issue to fix, and Parish Council decided that the best thing to do was to replace the whole switchboard. And we now have a brand new, very waterproof switchboard in there, and some work that's about to happen to fix the leaks in the roof. Well, I felt very helpless and was very glad that there were people who could help and do what I couldn't do to fix the problem. Perhaps, like Hannah, you've experienced the helplessness of not being able to have children, which for many couples, for men and especially for women, can be a source of great sadness and, as it was for Hannah, of great stigma. I can't promise you, if that's your experience, that God will give you the answer he gave Hannah. But Hannah's story does encourage you to look to God. Perhaps you've felt helpless struggling with some work or study that just seems too much or too hard. Perhaps you've struggled with chronic pain or with caring for a sick or dying loved one and feeling unable to do anything to help. Perhaps in your own life you've struggled with a sin that you're trying to repent of, but you find you just keep falling back into it and you feel powerless to do anything about that. Perhaps you felt helpless, lost in a strange place. I remember as a young man with a short-term mission team in Bolivia getting lost and feeling very helpless. We arrived in Santa Cruz and had a night's sleep, and the next morning the team leader there gave us some introductions, and then he gave us a little bit of money, a few Bolivianos, and he sent us out on an adventure with careful instructions about where to go and what to do. And before we went out, he said, write down the address of the base on a piece of paper, all of us, put it in your pocket, so that if you get lost, you have the address. We set off and we went to a market, and I stopped to look at something in the market, and when I looked up, the other 15 members of the team had all disappeared. I ran around the market and I couldn't find them. I was on my own and I was feeling a little lost. And I thought, it's okay, I have the address. And I looked in my pockets and there was no piece of paper. I didn't have the address. Now I was feeling a little panicked. And I thought, what do I do? It's okay, I think I remember the address. So I hailed a taxi and I said in my very limited Spanish the address as I remembered it, and the taxi driver looked at me like I was speaking a different language. I thought, okay, this isn't going to work. I think if I get to the Central Plaza, I can remember how to walk back from there. And I managed to tell a taxi driver that I wanted to get to the plaza. I got there, and then I started walking, a long walk up this dusty road. By now it was starting to get dark, and I was actually starting to feel a little bit frightened in this new country on my own with a few words of Spanish, struggling to remember where I was meant to go. And I asked a few people along the way as I walked, did they know the name of the street or this base? Nothing, blank looks everywhere. Well, as I prayed, I came to a corner and it looked like a familiar spot. And I thought, this might be the place. And I turned left, I turned right, and there was the base of Youth with a Mission. And I was safely back and very relieved. So being helpless led to praying, and praying led to God's kind help in answering my prayer. Well, Hannah's story encourages us to recognise our own helplessness and look to God as the help of the helpless. For all of us, there is a profound connection between Hannah's story and ours. The deepest connection between our stories and hers is not related to having children, but to becoming children, God's children. The Apostle Paul writes in Romans chapter 5, "You see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly." Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Christians, we were helpless in our sin, helpless to save ourselves, helpless to restore our relationship with God. And while we were still powerless, while we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. Christ died for us. That is what it means to be a Christian, and it is the only way to become one. To put your trust in Jesus is to recognise your own helplessness and look to God for help. Have you done that? If you haven't, you could do it now. You could pray to God and say, God, when I look at my life, I see my sin, all the ways I try to live without you, all the ways I live to please myself and not you, and I can't fix it. I'm helpless. Help me. I put my trust in you, in your love, in Christ who died for the ungodly. Save me and help me to live every day looking to you. Christians, that is how we are saved, and that is how we are to live in a world of self-help. God delights in situations of helplessness because they drive us to do what we were created to do, to look to him as the help of the helpless. Helplessness drives us to a question and an answer. In the words of Psalm 121, I lift my eyes to the mountains. Where does my help come from? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. We're going to sing those words together now.